We've entered the 7 o'clock hour here tonight on THS Radio. Time now for the Environment and Sustainable Development radio show, Think Globally Radio. Heard at 7 o'clock every Sunday evening. And it's a show that takes up issues of the environment and sustainable development. We have a very large archive of all of our past programs up at ThinkGloballyRadio.org. You can download those for free at any time and learn a lot about a real wide variety of different topics. That's one of the things that really drew me personally to the field of sustainability. Was there's such a diversity of issues within sustainability and the environment, and so many different ways to approach them. The economics, the science, the legal aspects. Tonight we're going to take up a bit of a longer view, actually. We're going to go into environmental history on tonight's episode of Think Globally Radio with me, Eric Paglia. Those that are not in the studio that are hosts of this show include David Truba, Josh Paglia, Lisa Runstein, who's coming back soon, hopefully, and also our newest guy, Richard Bloom. So they're all not here tonight, just me. And my guest is actually not here with me. It's a guy that I met a few months ago in August of this year down in Copenhagen. It seems like Copenhagen is the place to be when it comes to these environmental questions. It wasn't for anything to do with the UNFCCC or the COP15 process or anything like that. It was a conference for environmental historians, the first World Congress of Environmental History, a rather new discipline. Well, new in the sense of maybe 20 years or so, but still relatively new when it comes to academia. And I met one of the foremost researchers in the field of environmental history, Professor John McNeill of Georgetown University. I had a nice long chat with him and had a chance to record that, and that will be the basis of tonight's episode of Think Globally Radio, an interview with John McNeill, an environmental historian from Georgetown University. We've had other environmental historians on this show, most notably Sverker Sorlin, who is the foremost environmental historian here in Sweden. And we do hope to have him back on the show sometime in the very near future. But for tonight's episode, it's John McNeill. I'm going to be getting to that in just a moment. And it seems really suitable right now to bring a historian onto the show, because it feels like a very historical time with everything leading up to Copenhagen. As a matter of fact, it's just less than a month to go now. As of yesterday, it was a 1-month countdown to Copenhagen, a rather overused phrase perhaps, but it's true. It's coming right up. December 7th in Copenhagen, that's when the big negotiations start. Some things happening in this past week or so down in Barcelona. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show, perhaps. And also, in terms of the historical feeling of the moment, tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which also, it certainly has an environmental, historical aspect to that as well. The Cold War, of course, having major impacts on the environment around the world. As a matter of fact, John McNeill, his latest research that he's just embarking upon now, he mentions this a little bit later in the interview, but is on the environmental history of the Cold War. So that's something to look forward to as well. But why don't we first now get into part one of this interview. It's divided into two parts with John McNeill. So we'll hear part one. I'll come back, talk a little bit, and then we'll get into part two of the interview with John McNeill, done in Copenhagen in August of 2009, just a couple of months ago, talking on a wide range of environmental, historical, and mostly modern environmental history. We don't go way back into the paleo record or anything like that, like we did to a certain extent a few weeks ago, talking about the global cooling show that we had an author from Stockholm University on the show for that. But this is going to be more modern environmental history. And also some of today's issues. John McNeill is also a professor of international relations, so we talk a lot about Copenhagen in this interview and other environmental issues of today, and looking into the future a little bit as well. Maybe a bit of speculation into the environmental history of this century, which is still really yet to be written. So let's get into it now. Part one of the interview with Professor John McNeill here tonight on Think Globally Radio. So what factors drive history from an environmental perspective?
There's a lot of disagreement about that. My own view is that, at least as regards modern history, the last 200 years or so, the two most important driving forces generating the environmental changes that we've seen around the world are, one, the energy system that we've developed based around fossil fuels, first coal and now oil at the center of that. And interestingly, that is an energy system that's likely to change significantly in the fairly near future. And secondly, demographic factors, including both population growth and urbanization, the mass exodus from the countryside in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world, and the migration to the city and the spectacular growth of urban areas. So that, for example, half the world's population now lives in cities, whereas 100 years ago, around 14 or 15% of the world's population lived in cities, and 200 years ago it was probably about 5%. Those are the two main driving forces in my view, but there are some others, one of which would be sort of ideological and philosophical outlooks on the proper relationship between humankind and nature. These are many different cultures see things differently, but several cultures have shown themselves prepared to treat the environment primarily as a storehouse of raw materials for economic use. I would also add, lastly, the international political system and the emphasis that states have felt to prepare themselves economically and militarily for competition. And that, too, has driven some of the environmental change of modern times. So I'd list those four things, but at the heart, the energy system.
Okay, and taking this historical approach, this environmental historical approach, what can that teach us about contemporary problems and how to solve them, such problems as the energy problem, population demographics, and others?
I'm a bit skeptical of the proposition that history can tell us all that much about how to solve contemporary problems for a couple of reasons. First of all, every situation is different in its details, and details often matter. And perhaps more fundamentally, the nature and scope of contemporary environmental problems, at least the climate change problem, are unprecedented. And we really don't know how to deal with the political issues surrounding this, and the historical record isn't going to help us very much, I'm afraid. Now, that said, the historical record does include some cheerful examples of reasonably successful attempts to address environmental problems. In recent history, for example, the negotiations surrounding the manufacture and release of chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, which 20 years ago looked like a very difficult problem. Chlorofluorocarbons, when they get up into the stratosphere, they corrode the ozone layer, which protects us and all living things from ultraviolet B radiation. And the ozone layer was thinning. That's almost stabilized now, and it's going to reverse itself and thicken again fairly soon. And that's the outcome of international negotiations that began in the late 1980s and proved quite successful. Not perfectly successful, but that was a comparatively easy technical and political problem compared to climate change. So you can perhaps learn a little bit, but I fear not much.
Mm-hmm.